We're going to start now with session number 6. It's about bridging infrastructure and real estate projects, the funding gap. I would like to invite our moderator, Mr. Farah Saeed, the Head of Infrastructure Advisory, KPG Oman, and our speakers, Khalid Al-Kayed, the Chief Executive Officer of Bank Nizwa, Mr. Sulaiman Al-Harthi, Deputy CEO, Mithaq Islamic Banking, Bank of Muscat, and Mr. Badr Al-Shamfari, Deputy CEO, ONIC.
First of all, thank you very much for the organizers for arranging this panel and inviting us to share our thoughts with you. I'd like to start first of all by giving a brief introduction on the panelists and then give a short introduction to set the context for the topic, and then we'll move on to a discussion. So with me today, we have Mr. Sulaiman Al-Harthi, who's the Deputy CEO of Mithaq Islamic Bank. He has 30 years banking experience, and he's also board member of Sezad and Tatweer, the Park Oman Asset Management Company, and Al-Omnia Educational Services. We have Mr. Badr Al-Shamfari, who's the Deputy CEO of ONIC, and he was previously General Director of the Uzbek Oman Investment Company and currently sits on their investment committee. We also have Mr. Khalid Kayed, who's the CEO of Bank Nizwa and was previously the Deputy CEO of Safwa Islamic Bank and the CFO of Standard Chartered in Jordan. And we're here today to talk to you about real estate and infrastructure finance and how to bridge the gap. And before we get into that topic, I'll just set the context slightly. Globally, infrastructure is a fantastically strong growth sector. So whether you look at the US or Europe, where there are various infrastructure renewal programs being announced, Australia as well, to Asia and this part of the world where there's new infrastructure being developed, wherever you go, there is infrastructure investment being planned by all sorts of governments. Globally, the statistics say there's going to be a $57 trillion requirement for infrastructure by the year 2020. That's a lot of money, but the good news is that globally the liquidity does exist. The key to getting access to that liquidity is making sure that the projects are properly structured, so you have the right risk allocation during the construction and the operating phase, that you have the right commercial structure, that the projects can stand alone, can be commercially viable on their own, and that political risk is managed throughout the various countries in the most appropriate way. I think if you have that, if you have the right risk structure, the right commercial allocation, and the right political risk structure, liquidity is available. Real estate is slightly different from infrastructure in that here in Oman and in many other parts of the world, we are seeing a supply-demand imbalance. So in many parts of the world, they are suffering from oversupply of real estate. That's something particular to that sector, which is not necessarily applicable to the rest, and we'll cover that as well. So when you look at the global context, there is a lot of liquidity, there is a lot of projects out there, and I think the key for Oman is to understand how they can structure their projects in a way that they remain attractive to international investors and that they remain an attractive prospect to invest in. And in that, Oman has had a very good track record in things like power and utilities. So since the mid-1990s, there's been a very, very strong track record of bringing private sector into power and utilities. And going forward, I think the challenge will be how you can replicate that, modify it towards other sectors, so that within this global context, you can continue to bring investors into Oman. And that's, I think, what we will discuss today, and how to bridge the infrastructure gap. So to start with, what I'd like to ask each of the panelists is, first of all, just to explain a little bit about what their organization is doing within infrastructure and what you see as the key challenges going ahead. So if I may start with you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We in Mithaq have not done any infrastructure finance yet. However, Bank Muscat has done a lot of financing in the power and utilities, as mentioned. And our aim in the future is to follow the footsteps of Bank Muscat and find bankable, propositions where we could be involved in either direct financing or helping them to raise financing from the international.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you for this opportunity. Actually, just to touch on this question, we have to touch on the topic itself. It's infrastructure projects. And normally, we have to touch on the characteristics of this element, which is usually we are talking about huge investments. We are talking about long-term tenor, and in order to match that with the financing or to make the deal bankable, then you have to look into different aspects where in first look this will be in a high risk grading, then the financing cost will be higher. However, whenever the government can come and step in, things will be looking differently. From my position as a bank Nizwa, actually all the Islamic banks in Oman just coming 5 years back, so I think we still in early stage. However, in Bank Nizwa, we actually started from day one looking into such projects at a national level where we can actually use our capabilities as an Islamic bank with infrastructure, providing structured products to support such a product, but we have to take in our consideration the ability. We still in a small balance sheet size, or in order to come into that, you have some kind of limitation. So what we are doing as a Bank Nizwa, we targeting actually such products, and we went through direct financing. Either we are financing the working capital or the capital itself or trade finance. But I want to touch a little bit about the segment itself. When we are talking about infrastructure in general, and particularly maybe the case of Oman, such as we just mentioned, the characteristics of these projects where we have huge investments, we have also longer term, and the financing will be a little bit difficult to the locals. We see two players in the market. We have the international players, they are coming across the border, and the international banks with a massive capital, and they have their risk appetite is too low. They prefer usually to deal with the government level. So as a local banks, we decided strategic-wise to go to tier 2, where we directed and targeted the contractors. So Bank Nizwa already done from day one a lot of financing in all sectors going to the contractors. So we finance contractors, they are performing and executions projects with the government, as in roads or in all the logistic or all the sectors. So today we actually, I can say we have Bank Nizwa financed the infrastructure in all the segments. However, we targeted the contractors. So we are going into tier 2, and the reason for that is only because we're still a small bank, we are unable to go for that large. The way we are doing it, either we do it standalone when the amount of the financing is within our limit, or we went through club deals, either with Windows and other Islamic banks, or syndications. Maybe later we can touch on Sukuk as a means of financing.
Good morning, everyone. Oman National Investment Corporation is the financial investment arm of Oman Invest. Currently, we have around $500 million of assets under management. While none of them are in the infrastructure space, we are moving to become one of the leading private equity houses based out of Oman with a global footprint, where we see infrastructure is a key area of growth because of the funding gap, the requirement we talked about. So as an investor, we are looking to find alternative ways where it is attractive for the investor to come in and have the risk-adjusted returns, and also at the same time the government fulfills its ambitions of expanding infrastructure with a growing demographic its population. And one element I think we can touch upon is usually infrastructure is linked with greenfield projects that take a long term to develop and to get back your cash flow. And that shies away many investors. So we are looking forward to having potentially a pool of existing operating infrastructure being added to let's say, a fund that can then use part of its money for greenfield. However, from day one, you have income generating to its investors. So we're hoping that these opportunities will come in the near future and that the regulations will support it.
Thank you very much for that. So can I ask, I mean, I think the common theme that's coming out from all three of you is that you would like to invest in infrastructure. It's something that you see as positive and a growth story for Oman. Can I ask each of you, what do you see as the challenges in being able to deploy your capital into that sector?
Right. Basically, when the government budget is tight, or we know this in many countries, the countries sort to try and find other means of financing big, huge projects that require huge capital. So you mentioned about the utilities and power. These are $1 billion or $2 billion worth of project. But one key factor that made this project successful is because there is government offtake and the income streams of these projects are guaranteed. So the big challenge is to find, as I think Badr mentioned, the big challenge is to find similar projects where you have income streams that are guaranteed, that will be able to service whatever sort of financing that you provide. So one thing is that there are a lot of ideas in Oman. There are a lot of thinking, there are a lot of plans, there are a lot of, but these have to be put into action. For example, I came from Bahrain yesterday. I crossed the bridge to Saudi Arabia, and this bridge is a toll bridge. And we know that in Oman, we attempted to do toll roads, but these plans were shelved for some reason, for social reasons. So the one challenge is to actually step forward and do a similar project like this. So if you have a toll road, then there is many possibilities of financing a toll road. The other things would be, for example, even in the GCC, for example, in Qatar, the schools hospitals are all privatized. So, for example, hospitals, the government could come up with insurance scheme for the people. So instead of going to the hospital, instead of the government financing building a hospital and operating a hospital, it can be privatized, and people could be given insurance. So the people's right to get free health care is guaranteed, but also the government doesn't have to spend money and build a hospital. The hospital could be privatized, and people like us could come in and structure an appropriate financing structure for that. We actually, as Mitha, we have visited the Ministry of Health and proposed such ideas. We visited the Ministry of Education and proposed ideas like that. And we find that whether it is Ministry of Health or Ministry of Education, these plans are available with them. They had done a lot of studies about it, but the problem is the step forward to actually implement it. Also, Badr mentioned about assets that are available. So, for example, the government has spent enormous amount of monies in building ports. These ports are operational. So the government can unlock the value in these ports and use people like us to come and restructure and create infrastructure, finance, whether it is direct finance or issuing different types of financing paper, whether it is locally or international. But the key to this is that an asset has to have an income stream so that you could create, a financing structure for it. So this is a major, challenge that I.
Okay, that's a good long list, difficult list. Khaled, I saw you nodding along there. Was there anything that you'd like to add to that list of challenges that you see?
Oh, for sure. I think we are sharing the same challenges. However, maybe we'll have a high-level view here. We are in a country where we have an annual budget, and by normal, this is a accounting exercise. You have revenues and you have expenses. Our revenues going up and down variable because links to oil prices mainly as the main contributor, while on the expenses side, either capital operating is going into more in a semi-fixed or fixed. So whenever we are going through the economical cycle, we'll be facing a deficit or surplus. And we are talking here about the role of the banks and particularly the Islamic banks and Islamic finance being new and to be introduced as a diversification tool, because we are talking about diversification and we believe Islamic banks is coming as a one example of this diversification. So what is required here? We need to open doors for these Islamic banks in order to close this gap, which is the title of the session, is bridge the financing gap for particular products. Now, looking from the bank perspective, usually we are looking from credit perspective, wherever all the characters going into the high level of risk, where this should be priced and coming with a high cost, and this is something you have to carry. But what is required today, since we have underlying asset already active and producing income, as mentioned by my colleagues, there are two kinds of actions we can arrange. Banks can come and close this gap temporarily. The government already can make it more easier where they can give such kind of guarantee, which in Sultana within the national authority, it's nothing, just a guarantee for a couple of years. This will make the deal more doable, more bankable, and lower cost, because at the end of the day, we're all running with the same regime. Second, this is from one aspect. Two things. If we are talking about maybe partnership between the private sector and the public altogether, but two kind of projects we can, or two mechanisms we can use. If the government wants, as usual, to keep the ownership and the control, then the banks, they can come and do financing in a term period, and they may ask for the government guarantees in order to make things more easier. So in a 5 years, 7 years time, then when the budget will reflect a surplus to the government, they will be in a better position to clear this deficit and go on to another project. The other thing which is more critical, and I think maybe it will come as a stage 2, because we need to build the infrastructure for that, as mentioned by Suleiman and Badr. We already have some kind of assets within the government. I will not talk about the boards, but maybe the airport, for example, where you can bring someone to purchase and lease back, and the government will be paying from the rent of that to close that. So you can generate leaving cash to the government from the institution without losing the control of the government. What is required? I think all the players in this market, either the financiers or the government or the regulators, they should sit together and try to put some kind of mechanism where, yes, you open the door and make it easier. That the main role of banks is to step in, close the temporary gap, and then later we'll go on a new stage and looking for a new project.
Thank you. Thank you. And Badr, just again, I'll ask you the challenges as well, but just one specific thing. Khaled has talked about the government guarantees and offtake, and I guess he comes at it from a perspective of a debt investor. As an equity investor, are you also looking at the same levels of government offtake, or would you have a slightly different risk appetite?
I think, again, depending on the risk profile and the return, because if you look at the model which you mentioned, the power sector, that played a key role in attracting international investors. So having government offtake definitely improves the viability of the project, but naturally, and you would accept a lower return. However, looking at the opportunities, and going back to your first question, the challenge for us, why we haven't invested, it's because of the income generation being owned by a public listed company. You would want to see the results, you're measured quarterly against long-term investments. And that's where we see, as equity investors, you'll be willing to take more risk in the sense that you're driven by the return, whereas from the government end, they want naturally the infrastructure to be built to the quality and expectation that that's needed. If we are open to having multiple solutions, I think there are ways where you can find the objective of both the investor and the government. It doesn't have to be an offtake, but there can be, especially again, from going back to operating assets where you have history of the flow of income. In greenfield, that is naturally area where most investors would request some sort of offtake. But if I would, again, I'm advocating for combining existing assets and then taking the risk of the greenfield. That combination is something which I think can be a win-win for both investors and for the government without having to guarantee certain offtake.
That's interesting. So if you look at Oman, the existing assets that you have, as Khalid mentioned, you've got the airport, potentially the ports, and you've got all the power and water companies that have been running for the last 20 years, some of which are listed. Now, as those assets reach the end of their life, some of these power plants and so on, do you see any potential for those to be acquired from the existing holders, to be bought into funds and try and build this sort of balanced portfolio of new and old that you're saying?
I believe so. And I think one key element for investors as well is liquidity. So currently we're going asset by asset based, but I'm sure if you're able to pool multiple assets, that will first of all make it more diverse. Secondly, listing that vehicle can give you liquidity in an international sense. And the other thing as well, we don't have to be restricted to Oman-focused funds. It can be a regional fund that invests in infrastructure. That will give you as well liquidity. And I think when you talk about infrastructure, it's broad, so it includes even, as Sulaiman mentioned, healthcare, also education as well. And the key word here is, which we've seen in my previous role at SGRF, is the efficiency that the private sector brings in, but not compromising, of course, on the quality, because there is definitely a critical social element, especially when you talk about healthcare and education. But this is where, again, we talk about public-private partnerships. As long as both sides are meeting their objectives, and we can think a little bit outside the box in terms of alternatives, I believe there are multiple solutions.
Okay, good. Yes, go ahead.
I mean, again, if you talk about infrastructure, we've seen examples, for example, in the UK, where even the jails are not managed by, they are not managed by the government. The government has privatized the jail. So this is one of what Badr is saying, that the private sector brings in efficiency, brings in cost reduction. So the government could stay as a regulator in healthcare, in education, in different other, healthcare infrastructure, in different infrastructure projects. The government could remain as a regulator, and as long as these assets have got certain income, or the government, instead of them building it and spending money in operating them, they put them for banks or for other funds to actually fund them, and the government could unlock the enormous amounts of capital that is invested in these projects.
Good. So I think there's a lot of good ideas here, and it's good to look at what other countries are doing. Now, From your profiles that we mentioned earlier, all of you are involved in various overseas activities as well. So as you are investing around the world, what do you see as in the global community, what do you see as the perception of Oman as a destination for infrastructure investment? And what could Oman be doing to play on its strengths and enhance its profile?
I have said this in many occasions. Oman has done extraordinarily in terms of the politics, in terms of safety of the country, in terms of a destination for tourism. But we have not been able to translate this in actually attracting FDI and making it the country that I mean, today, many people know you go to many countries and you are standing at a queue and waiting for a visa and you having your passport on your hand, and there would always be somebody who would recognize you as an Omani, and sometimes they take you and put you in front of the others and finish your visa process. So Oman's name internationally is absolutely fantastic, and how could we translate the reputation of Oman in the world in business and convert that into FDIs that would flow into Oman? So that's a big question that we should have. And I think there is enormous potential in Oman because, one, the legal regime is very, very welcoming. In areas, for example, like in free zones, I can talk a little bit about Duqm, for example, because I'm part of it. The incentives that are given to foreign investors, I mean, we usually talk about Omanization, the incentives even in capital repatriation, profit repatriation, the enormous, one thing that we usually don't, give a value to is, let's say you are from India or from Pakistan or from Egypt and you have a project, a factory, and you want to expand. You need land. So imagine if you're in India and you want 100,000 square meters of land. Where would you get that kind of land? In Oman, you get a very high, very good land in front of the port, which might reduce your costs of infrastructure by maybe 10 to 15%. You get power that is not, interrupted. You get now there are possibilities that there could be gas. So we have a lot, enormous, USP that we can sell out there in the world and attract investment.
Good. Same question to the other panelists.
Yes, actually I think this is very clear that Oman has advantages when it comes into the political situation, the geographical location, on all other aspects, security, infrastructure, everything is going positive. As Sulaiman mentioned, now it's time to translate this in a value. As simple as maybe we have to be fair with the government. I think the example of the free zones, as Sulaiman mentioned, is a very excellent example, but we have to work to make this example excellent. Then you can duplicate and extend the concept. Now you have the Duqm, you have Sohar, you have Salala. I think with the facilities provided by the government, this is something very open to the foreign investors to come and enjoy the benefits offered by the country. These are, now we have this example, let us work and see how can we facilitate. On the other aspect, in order to make that, I think the government, along with other players like banks or others, they can use the lines from development banks, for example, the Asian one or Islamic Development Bank, IMF, whatever, they have lines granted to the country in order to do invest in the infrastructure itself. So some kind of collaboration between the local banks with the international under the supervision of the government. This can boost and increase the flow of the investment. This is already happening, and we are in Bank Niswa financing one contractor where the fund is coming from the Islamic Development Bank, for example. So this is something we are bridging with the Ministry of Finance. So something already on the ground, we need to expand the role, we need to go more into the second level. So I think the example of the foreign free zones is an excellent example if we can really make it workable and we can get the value into that. And based on this experience, we can move into the second stage. I think a lot of opportunities. Everyone can read the profile of Oman globally as a very excellent and very positive compared to others, in spite of all the facts that this should be reflected into a value to the country. And I think everyone in this country, either the government or private sector, will be responsible to take the responsibility to bring this value to the country.
Good.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to repeat what you mentioned, but it's definitely in this part of the world an attractive feature, which is the political stability and also naturally the geographical location. And going back to your question, why has that not attracted as much as we want? I think naturally it's an evolution. There has been lots of changes in regulation in favor of foreign direct investments. There have been others that have shied away. For example, the gas hike and taxes, which wasn't. Some investors looked at it as a bit of a surprise. However, I believe with the inauguration now or the start of Duqm refinery, inshallah, I think that will also attract lots of investors. There's usually hesitation for the first large project, but as we've seen how Sahar has developed over the years, I believe that will attract lots of opportunities to the region. And it's also, I think, the role is on investment companies like ourselves to work with international partners to set up a fund. I think I repeated it many times. Infrastructure fund, which can bring in the international investors, and when they see a local partner who's an anchor investor, you have the governance in place, you have, in terms of the political stability, the geographic location, and the potential. So I believe it is a matter of time, and everyone is heading in the right direction, whether it's from the regulations to investors. And it's now a matter to execute, which is tanfeed, and that's I think the name that was used.
Understood. So you touched on the FDI law. I mean, other things that the government is doing, the PPP law, for example, that's coming. Yeah. Do you see that having an impact on Oman's perception and making it easier to raise finance?
I mean, definitely from our side. I was, as mentioned, I was earlier in Uzbekistan, and there, how can you? I mean, for any investor, the first question he asks, can I take my money out? So rules, regulations play a critical role in your in bringing in investors. So by having the regulations clearly, demonstrating what's expected from the private sector, what's there from the public as well. I believe that's definitely a positive step towards attracting more FDI.
Okay, good. The other thing I wanted to touch on, and again, just building on what you gentlemen were saying, you mentioned the Asian Development Bank and so on. We do see throughout the infrastructure world, there are new players emerging. So there is the Asian Infrastructure Bank, pension funds are coming in, there's Chinese government money coming in, ECAs are getting more active. How do you see these new sources of liquidity that are emerging? How do you see them sitting alongside the existing traditional sources of liquidity, so the traditional funds and the traditional banks? Is there enough capacity in the market to absorb all these different potential sources of finance? Will they have different requirements in terms of how the transactions are structured? How do you see everyone working together?
First of all, emerging of these new sources of financing is a very welcoming thing, because, again, it's the same thing we're talking about, that they see Oman as a fertile land for for their investments, and these investments are always looking at good bankable propositions, and the more they come, there will be more competition. So competition is always good. And I go back to the same point I made earlier. As long as there is a good bankable proposition, there would be a lot of funds looking to invest in this. And we've seen, for example, as you mentioned, the Chinese are very, very keen not to just come as contractors, but they're also coming and funding these projects, like we have in Duqm, like they have also participated in the government fundraising. So it's a very good and welcoming thing, and competition is always welcomed.
Okay.
Yes, if you allow me, actually, I think first we should identify the size. Two things very clear vision-wise coming from the government, which is Tanfeed, and also the 5 years economical plan 2016 to 2020. So we have such kind of identifying the scope, projects, sectors, everything is identified, and within Tanfeed themselves, they identify the size of projects and others. So if we are keeping this in our mind, I'm trying to go further. I think we know the capacity within Oman, within the banking sector, within the government to fund and to support. So whenever we have newcomers, they are very welcome to come and, as mentioned by Suleiman, and there will be a room for a good combination between the local resources as well as the newcomers, because at the end, you have to open, you have to bring people. Whenever there is a project in Duqm, after 5, 10, 20 years, the project will stay here in the country, and maybe it will change the ownership. So I think we have a clear vision on the size of the projects we are targeting through Tanfeed in order to do the diversification. So sectors already identified, such kind of projects already identified. When it comes onto the financing, we have alternatives. You can go through internal, local financing within the liquidity available, some kind of capital budget allocation. Maybe we'll go through these lines with Asian banks, investment development banks, other kind of initiatives to come into country, or we can do the participation between the private sector as well as the government, and this can be financed. In local banks, actually, what we did, even in banking as well, we did some kind of cooperation with GCC banks. We went through the risk participation concept. We have a client and their request is too big for us as a small bank to tackle it. Then we discuss with such banks through the financial institutions. We opened lines. We analyzed the client and we understand it's all going into infrastructure projects. And they came and they joined us. So such kind of relationship, not only coming from the investors, but also inter-bank relationship can also add into the value of the country.
Good. Okay. The other thing, and we've talked a lot, and I'm conscious we're coming towards the end, but we've talked a lot about the front end of infrastructure and how to finance the development aspect and the construction of it. Looking towards the other end, and people have talked about cash flow and government offtakes and so on. Looking at it from the perspective of the end user, whether that's an owner-occupier of real estate, whether it's a user of a hospital, a pupil at a school, do you see any potential innovations that can be made in terms of financing the end users? Whether it's subsidized mortgages, specialist housing development banks, that can therefore create demand amongst end users and perhaps reduce or give greater certainty to cash flow and perhaps take care of some of the offtake issues coming at it from the other side?
I think specifically if we start with the mortgage financing, I think Oman is very highly developed compared to almost all the GCC countries in the regulations and also the terms for financing of specifically on mortgage side. With all the banks without any exception are very, very clear and very, very well developed. I think mortgage financing in Oman could be one of the easiest, if not in the GCC, maybe in the Middle East as a whole. In Oman, generally, I can say maybe 80% of the people have got, their own house. And the additional mortgage that, or the incremental growth in mortgage financing we see is that people are having a second and a third house. So end user financing specifically on mortgage is very, very highly, I don't know that Khalid will agree with me on that, but the other end user financing, for example, of education and healthcare. With regard to education, general education is free in Oman, so the financing would be for people who want to take their kids in the postgraduate or undergraduate studies. That to an extent is also not, banks have got financing structures for that. Healthcare, as I mentioned, so there would be like, insurance, health insurance schemes that people can buy into. So there would be like insurance companies, banks, as bank insurance could also develop products that will cover that. So I think generally the banking and the products for end users are very well developed, but as long as there is demand, banks will also come up with new ideas, new concepts of financing this.
Okay. Anything to add, or?
Yeah, I'm just adding to the end user, adding to about education and healthcare. So this is, while it's free for the general, for the government, it's one of the high items for OPEX. And not in Oman, but in one of the countries we looked at, they were mentioning that the cost per student, I believe for some of the areas are more than 8,000 riyals per year. So there is some, again, inefficiency in the process where the student is not getting the quality education that the government strives for. At the same time, it is costing the government more than what they are, what they want to, that's sustainable actually. So a solution can be if you're able to not outsource, but to monitor a private school that provides this quality education, at the same time reducing the burden on the government and the end user, the student, getting quality education. I think that's a perfect formula. It's not it's easier said than done, but I think that's the sustainable model.
Okay. Good. Thank you. As we reach the end of the session, I think we've touched on a number of topics, but as sort of closing remarks or anything, is there anything that you would like to touch on that we perhaps haven't covered?
Yeah, one point that I would like to touch, since we're here in the economic forum, is that many times people in Oman, particularly business people, they say that we wish the government would do that, we wish the government would enhance these regulations and this, so there's a lot about what the government should do, but there is less about what we should do. I think, for example, even the subject of attracting FDI, I think it's the responsibility of each and every business in Oman, because the government has done enough. The government has done actually more than what they should if you compare what the government here and many other countries around us or even within the world. And the good thing is that the government in Oman is a listening government. So if you have a good proposition to the government, they listen to you, and most of the time they will come back to you with whatever. So going back again, I think it's the responsibility of each and every business to work towards fulfilling this objective, because it is for Oman, it's not for an individual person. So everyone has got the responsibility. So.
Great.
Yes, and I think two things. The first thing is we have to be clear that there is a role should be done by the private sector And yesterday, maybe we heard about opening door for more privatization from the government. My point here, we have to be careful. Some experience with other countries, it went not successfully. So it should be done in a very careful way in order to control the cost and the related matters. The second, when it comes into the banking sector, as we mentioned, there is a role we want to do. We need doors to be open. Things should be done in a very dynamic way because we understand the government today it's with a deficit, tomorrow they are in a surplus. So banks should come into a stage to close this gap. This should be very clear. It's a mandatory and it's the duty of banks to do this job to keep the economy and the growth in the economy going in a positive side. This is very important. So there is a role should be done. Doors should be open. Privatization also is some concern that should be, we should do that, but there should be some kind of control to be into that. That's from my side.
Badr?
I would just finally like to add that, again, the role of investors, I agree, they have to look to bring in FDI and creating investment opportunities. And at the end, I'm optimistic that this infrastructure funding gap will be met and we will have a win-win situation where the government and end users benefit from the best infrastructure available. At the same time, it's a sustainable model that is, inshallah, for many years to come.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So with that, I'd like to thank each of you for participating and providing your thoughts. I think there's a lot of food for discussion here, but if I can just summarize, I think the key messages that are coming out is that yes, government needs to do a few things around cash flow, certainty, offtakes, but there are many things that the private sector and us as individuals can also be doing to kickstart the infrastructure, but also, Badr, the key point that you made about perhaps balancing investments so that you have a nice mix of infrastructure that people can invest in. And in a country like Oman, where you're at the start of the journey, where a lot of the infrastructure is new, the challenge is going to be to find the old and the new assets that can sit together. And maybe that's therefore something that has to be done perhaps on a slightly regional level so that you have older assets from overseas sitting with newer assets in Oman. Something to think about. But yes, thank you very much and great. Thank you.